My name is Victor Johnson. I am the communications assistant. The reason it's important to see Black art in the museum for me is because growing up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, when I would go to the museum, I don't recall seeing a lot of Black art nor feeling like I was accepted in the museum because of my representation of how I dressed and talked and act. So when I get to see something that I can see myself in, I really enjoy it. So the piece I want to talk about today is Jacob Lawrence and God Created All Man and Woman. One of the things that I can relate to is seeing a Black pastor wearing colorful clothing. He's looking up kind of out the window. He's got his hands in the air, so that's a form of expression. I feel like if you ever gone to a Black church, pastors usually really shows expression and emotion in the message that they're trying to say. If you look at the crowd, some of them are looking at the pastor, while some are also looking outside of the window at what he's emphasizing to. And for me, that kind of relates in a way of like being in the church, sometimes being focused on what the word was, sometimes being focused on the action of the words, sometimes just not being focused at all because the message just wasn't talking to me. In the window pane, there is a representation of men and women. Each figure is painted white, which is kind of like a duality of the Black church and the white savior complex. I went to a religious-based school. It was predominantly white, and so I always related the difference in the church experience. It was a thought process of like, God is still white, white is right, the white person's gonna save me, not seeing beauty in my own self. I think it's very important for us to have representation of our backgrounds, just so you can see yourself in greatness. If you see it, you can achieve it. If you achieve it, you can believe it. You know what I mean? If I was younger, I think if I saw more of it, I may have gotten into this route a little bit earlier in life. We have, as Black Americans, such a fine print, and sometimes it's not recognized to the level that I feel like it should be.
Welcome to Binder. I'm Drew Barron. Hey y'all, producer Drew here. I'm a lucky guy. You know why? Because I'm sitting across from Dr. Nancy Tolson. Nancy, I've been trying to find the best way to introduce you, and I've been going over all of your accomplishments.
Wow.
And honestly, I have found that it's easier to list the things that you haven't done than what you have. So here it goes. Has never been a guest on Binder.
That's really good.
And that's it.
That's it.
I couldn't find anything else. You've done everything
Scuba
else.
Scuba diving, that's another one I haven't done.
You haven't gone scuba diving?
No, I haven't gone scuba diving. I was
terrified
on a boat with a scuba diver, but never, ever have I been scuba diving. But go ahead.
I'm absolutely terrified of the idea of scuba diving, so I do not. Yeah. No,
well, I don't know how to swim.
Claustrophobic. That freaks me out.
Oh, I don't know how to swim. That's going to be one of my 2023 goals, is to learn how to swim.
All right, so I'm going to get into a really tight space and be afraid, and you're going to go swimming.
That's right. I'm going to learn to love the water. Mm-hmm.
Well, obviously, I'm joking. I'm going to say at least some of the things you've done.
Mm-hmm.
This is the short part of a much longer list, but you are the Assistant Director of African American Studies at the University of South Carolina. You received your master's and PhD from the University of Iowa, researching the history and development of Black children's literature. You've been a Ford Fellow, an NEH facilitator, a Fulbright Scholar. You're an author of 2 books, Black Children's Literature Got the Blues, The Creativity of Black Writers and Illustrators, and Tales of Africa in 1998. You are currently one of the commissioners here at the Columbia Museum of Art. You're an active docent here at the Columbia Museum of Art. You're an extremely active member of the FAAC, the Friends of African American Art and Culture, here at the Columbia Museum of Art. So the question I have for you is, when do you go to sleep?
You know, I sleep between the hours of 11 and 4 a.m. And for some reason, I'm automatically awake at 4. And then I do my own little side thing. And then I get ready for work. Would you believe that?
What's your little side thing? You can't see the face she just made. She's not going to say it. She's not going to say it. I know what it is.
Right.
She's not going to say it, though.
Go-go dancer.
Yeah,
No.
that's what it is.
No, I do art. It gives me peace. And I think that's what starts my day, by doing a little bit of art every morning.
So, like, you have a really interesting and long-standing relationship with art.
Mm-hmm.
Where did that come from? Like, were you just naturally a creative person in your whole life? Like, how did you get
think
there?
so. I think I was given the freedom to carry my crayons up until adulthood. When I was at the University of Iowa as a TA teaching courses to students, I would say to them, when did you stop using crayons? And, that was a big pause, and some of them would just look real strange because when did we stop using crayons? Well, I've always kept crayons or coloring pencils or something like that. The creativity is something that's important in everyone. As a storyteller, I learned that I am the one who's giving you a verbal coloring book, and it's your imagination to fill in the colors. So I think that we all have it. Our artistic side, it's just that a lot of times we don't reveal it. But what brings you joy? Art brings me joy. Art is an experience, and art is everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And imagine a world that didn't have that.
Right.
You can't.
No.
It's not even fathomable. It's so entrenched in our life and culture and the way that we see the world. Like, we can't imagine a world where art doesn't exist. It's just not possible.
It's always there. And in many other cultures, art is just a part of life. Everything is created as creatively. But I believe that art is one of the greatest gifts that we have. We talk about secret code these days. I don't even know do you know cursive writing?
So technically, yes, I can read it. And I can write most of it. I can't do a Z. Z's are really hard in cursive.
That is so funny.
It looks like a G. I don't understand it. I'm going to be honest. I was of the generation that had to learn it, though.
Yeah.
Generations after me, I believe that just wasn't even a thing.
And that's so artistic. The writing, I think that's so beautiful. And how we write is even artistic. I mean, printing is nice, but that cursive, oh, come on. Even the strokes are beautiful. And so when we talk about things, we don't talk about identifying art. We're talking about define it. It's crazy.
Well, I'd like to identify another type of art that you are a huge advocate for, and that is African American art. Of all the people I know, and I've been a lot at the museum, and of all the people I know, there is not a bigger advocate in this building for Black artists than Dr. Nancy Tolson. I think this is one of the first times that I can remember, and I am younger, and I understand
it's all good,
but that I can remember it really hitting the national stage the way that it is today. I mean, you think about artists like Kehinde Wiley being able to do Obama's portrait for the National Gallery. Right. I mean, Robert S. Duncanson's loan from the Smithsonian American Art Museum that was brought to President Biden for the White House. This wasn't happening 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Exactly. It's a big moment. But with that being said, there's still a lot of room to grow.
Oh my. This is not a peak. This is not a mountain peak where there can only be one best. This is a Mesa Mountain where it's a flat top, and there's so much room for all of the artists that are out there, but all the artists that have never gotten the correct recognition, from the past. And that's where museums are walking in. These museums are bringing out Robert Duncanson. Come on. So many others, Charles Porter,
right?
And then Edmonia Lewis. And it's like 6 degrees of separation of this lineage of these artists and who influenced who. It's just amazing. And so that, as I said, that's where these museums walk in. I grew up in Detroit. The Detroit Institute of Art was one of my first ways of knowing what art is. And there's several Robert Duncansons there. But having a museum here that is willing to grow, willing to expand, and welcome Black art in, as well as other art by people of color, has been phenomenal. And right now we have the Samela Lewis collection of the artwork of Elizabeth Catlett and friends. And upstairs we have the Judy and Patrick Diamond collection. So we have 2 Black exhibits going on at the Columbia Museum of Art right now. Right now, ladies and gentlemen, need to come out and see it, because Elizabeth Catlett will be gone on the 22nd of January.
By the time this airs, it will already be gone. Sorry.
Oh.
But you know what will be on view? That will
go.
also include some wonderful Black artists from America.
Mm-hmm.
Is Our Own Work, Our Own Way,
Yes.
which will open after this airs. So it'll already be open.
Right,
You
it
can
will be.
walk through the door,
Mhm.
see 42 amazing Southern women artists
Yes.
through the 20th century
Mhm.
that are really going to floor you. And more importantly, Forward Together, the other exhibition you just mentioned,
Right.
will still be on view.
Will still be on view.
And I'm excited to say that not only did I bring Nancy in here to talk to me, because I could talk to Nancy all day, but I also brought you in here to talk to Patrick Diamond himself, because he's going to be
Yes.
here in the studio in just a moment.
So excited to talk to him. And what's the beauty of that is that it will be here. It'll be running till April 2nd. And the great overlap of the 2 that we just mentioned is that Jacob Lawrence is in the Patrick Diamond collection, and his wife, Gwendolyn Knight, is in the other collection, Our Own Way. They're just wonderful. So you need to come down to that. Unfortunately, you did miss Elizabeth Catlett.
Well,
Sad.
you know, if you're listening to this now and you're
Yeah.
feeling that FOMO, all that regret for not having come to see Elizabeth Catlett, I have good news for you. If you start coming now to all the exhibitions that we
Wow.
have, you'll
Mhm.
never miss one again.
You'll never.
Nancy,
Mhm.
I have a gut feeling that everyone's really tired of hearing my voice.
Oh, my.
So why don't we just go ahead and transition to your conversation with Patrick and get me out of here?
Okay, there you go. Hello, friends, and welcome to another Binder edition. And we are talking today with Patrick Diamond. We have his collection here, Forward Together, African American Art, from the Judy and Patrick Diamond collection. I hope that you all can make it here to Columbia Museum of Art to see it sometime before it leaves in April. And I want to welcome you, Patrick Diamond.
Thank you, Dr. Tolson. It's a real privilege to be with you here at the museum. And again, I thank you and the staff for inviting me to be a part of this broadcast today.
Yes, thank you. You know what I want to ask you? As a child from Frogtown, did you ever see yourself being at the Columbia Museum of Art doing an interview?
Well, no. Again, I was born here in Columbia in 1950 and have fond memories of my school days at St. Martin Catholic Elementary School, and also have fond memories of wonderful trips that my family and I would take to visit our grandparents in Augusta, Georgia. Those are my most vivid and exciting memories about my birth here in Columbia.
Okay. Now tell me what got you hooked on Black art?
My wife and I are absolutely hooked on African American art.
Mm-hmm.
Judy, my wife, she's actually my college sweetheart. And this year we'll be celebrating our 50th wedding anniversary. And actually, from the very first week of our marriage, we started collecting art. We were actually involved with a program very similar to the Peace Corps at that time. This is 1973, but we both had volunteer jobs in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and there was artwork on every corner as we, got settled in the city and started moving around. So we actually started collecting African art during the first week of our marriage. And then that sort of transition when we got back to the States. we started focusing attention on African American art, and just have over time have just been absolutely captivated by, some of the extraordinary artists that we've been able to get to meet, build friendships with. And Nancy, sometimes I have to pinch myself because Judy and I just were super, super lucky to have met them, in many cases at the height of their success.
Yes.
But at the same time, they were, we were able to acquire works in some cases directly from them. And they were such wonderful individuals that, again, they allowed us to become a part of their circle of friends.
Isn't that
so
wonderful?
it was just unbelievable.
Right. I want to pinch you because of that.
Yeah, a dear friend of mine who's an art dealer, and she describes collecting African American art as a magic carpet ride.
Yes.
And for us, that's what it's been. Again, when you meet Jacob Lawrence, you meet Catlett, you meet Bearden, Huey Lee Smith, Leo Twiggs. We met Dr. Samela Lewis in Chicago. Artists like Ernest Critchlow again. Richard Hunt is a dear buddy. He's, his sculpture work can be seen all over the world.
Yes.
And, Radcliffe Bailey down in Atlanta.
Right.
Some of these experiences have been, absolutely extraordinary.
So tell me about your first experience. What museum was your first experience of African American art?
Well, let me say that in 1980, Judy and I were visiting my family in New York, and we learned that there was a Romare Bearden exhibition on display at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. And Judy convinced everybody that the entire family should go. I had one of the most moving experiences of my life. His work took me right back to my grandmother's home in Augusta, Georgia. She actually introduced me to art. My grandmother's home was the first time that I had ever seen black and white framed photographs.
Wow.
And artwork hung in the family room, in the living room, in the hallways. But somehow, thank goodness, I was able to lock away in the back of my mind that this environment is something that I want to duplicate at some point in time. When I have my first apartment, when I have my first home, I want my home to be like Grandma's place, where, again, just very comfortable and with art objects that were exciting to just look at.
Yeah, I think I've had that same experience. There were new black galleries coming up in Detroit.
Oh, yeah.
And one had a exhibition that they were bringing in James Vanderzee. He's in a wheelchair by this time, but the exhibition was just phenomenal. And he was such a humorous gentleman, explaining his art and what he did and all of this. The photographs were just absolutely beautiful. And that moved me.
Sure.
But we too always had art on the walls.
One of my we don't have an awful lot of photographs in our collection, although we have some. But one of my very favorite photographs is a picture of James Vanderzee and Romare Bearden examining one of Bearden's prints.
Wow.
And it actually is a photograph that was taken by Jeannie Matusimi Ashe.
Oh, wow.
Wife of former tennis great Arthur Ashe. She's a professional photographer out of New York. And she had a friendship with Bearden and sort of did a lot of photographs of Bearden and his work. And she captured this image of Vanderzee and Bearden sitting side by side. It just sort of speaks to me. Like you say, two extraordinary African-American artists, or just two extraordinary American artists.
Yes.
I mean, they were both just top-notch, extraordinary 20th century artists.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm always fascinated when I see those photographs with more than one artist together. You know, Jacob Lawrence, I know, and Romare Bearden, or Charles Austin, his cousin, right?
Charles Austin, was Bearden's cousin, right?
Right, and Benny Andrews' father, who of course was an artist as well.
Right.
You know,
his mother was too.
Yeah, but you know, I find your picture that's here, the Benny Andrews picture that's here, that's one of a kind. Am I correct?
Yes, that's one of his collages. Yes.
Yes.
Judy and I met Benny Andrews in the early 90s. He had an exhibition at the Diggs Gallery at Winston-Salem State, and we were able to meet Benny. The gallery director invited us, along with several other visitors to the exhibition, to have dinner with Benny after the program. And out of that evening gathering, Benny Andrews invited Judy and I to visit him in his studio in New York, and just had a wonderful time with Benny and his wife. He and I spent 3 or 4 or 5 hours in the studio together. And then we continued an 8 to 10 year friendship as a direct result of that visit. Just one of the most important African-American artists that I've ever met. You know, such a significant force within African-American art. You'll remember that Benny Andrews was one of the artists, you know, after moving to New York and after having graduated the Art Institute of Chicago, you know, when he got to New York, there were very few galleries that would represent African-American artists.
Yes.
And also museums were reluctant to show African-American artwork in their exhibitions. And Benny, along with other important artists, sort of spearheaded all sorts of protests.
Oh, yes.
To change that. You know, some folks refer to Benny as the Martin Luther King of the museum world, because he would actually lead marches in and around Manhattan, to motivate and encourage the museums to show, you know, the work of important African-American artists.
Right. Yes. And I do know the whole concept of them being activists.
Oh, yes.
But, you know, I always think that Black art is political. And I think that most of them are activists, because you have to really do a lot of work to get your pieces in. And especially in New York during that time.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, like you say, you know, even though New York was, you know, such an important cultural center in the 50s, 60s, 70s, important Black artists still ran into racist situations, you know, right there in Manhattan, you know, and thank goodness there were artists, as you mentioned, you know, like Jacob and Bearden and Benny Andrews and others who made a difference. They decided that they were going to fight that system. And the good news is, I mean, you know, as we celebrate African-American art today, and many of the successes that we enjoy today, it's a direct result of the work that they were doing in the, you know, 60s, 70s, and 80s.
True. The collection that you have, it's, to me, so much love. It's a blessing to know that you all have them, because there's not as many Black collectors that I know of that have a collection such as yours.
Well, the good news is the numbers are growing.
Yes,
the numbers
they
are
are.
growing. Thank goodness the numbers are growing. I think that African Americans have begun to, you know, appreciate the importance of these artists. Maya Angelou, in one of her books, she makes a reference to the importance of African American artists, and I forget exactly how the passage goes, but she says, you know, African American artists confirm our humanity and our history. They inspire us, and they put starch in our backbones to help us stand erect. Yeah, you know, when you think about, again, Catlett's work and her first husband's work, Charles White. I mean, recording Black history. And some of these artists, for the first time, this history was being recorded.
Yes.
You know, and thank goodness some museums and some collectors understood the important value of acquiring and maintaining these treasures, right? I'm just so happy that today more and more African American artists are having, opportunities to continue to pursue their professions.
Yes.
And many of them are able to do it full time. There are a lot of, that first generation of African American artists, they couldn't do it full time.
Correct.
They had to have a full time job and then do the artwork
on the side. Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Bearden was a full time social worker.
Yeah.
Up until he was mid 50s.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, today the good news is these artists are so talented. And they're getting recognition at wonderful museums like this one here in Columbia, as well as museums around the country.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. We take our students, we have an alternative spring break. It's called the Civil Rights Tour. And we take them to some of the southern states. We always go to a museum.
Sure.
That's mandatory so that they can see the art, know what we've done, and see how beautiful Black art is.
Ooh. Oh yeah. We have one child, and Judy and I both wanted our son to grow up around images of African American art and culture. We wanted him to, participate, say, in class trips. If they took a trip to a local museum or a regional museum, and he saw a Picasso or a Miro, he would say, "Oh, gee, that's interesting." But he would also have been familiar with Jacob Lawrence and Elizabeth Catlett and Romare Bearden, and say, "Oh, that's similar to Bearden. That's similar to Jacob." Picasso, as we know, utilized an awful lot of African art in his masterpieces, right? So again, we wanted our son to have a broad experience, and certainly one that made African American art and African American culture, important to him and important to our family.
That's beautiful. I'm in children's literature, and my specialty is Black children's literature.
Oh, okay.
And it's for the same reason. I wanted my children to make sure that they saw images of themselves in those books.
So important.
And so I learned who Ernest Critchlow was through children's books. And of course, Romare Bearden has several, and Jacob Lawrence. So they grew up having those books because I wanted to make sure they knew what a firm foundation.
Right.
And I think that's so important.
And absolutely critical, so that these youngsters have that connection to their culture.
Yes.
Get familiar with that important history. Because in the United States of America, that's critical.
Yes.
That is absolutely critical. Obviously, our world today is a better world than it was in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. But still, it's important for these youngsters, both Black and white, to understand our history.
Yes.
To understand American history, to understand American culture, the honest American history and honest American culture. It's critical.
It is. And that's why it's so critical to actually have the exhibit that we have today upstairs.
Nice outro, Nancy. Patrick Diamond, along with his wife Judy, are art collectors based in Charlotte, North Carolina. You can see some of their collection here at the CMA in Forward Together, on view through April 2nd. Learn more about the Diamond's journeys in collecting art in the book, The Incredible Joy of Collecting African American Art, a self-published memoir written by Patrick Diamond. Coming up.
One of the important things in the African American culture is that you got to be able to rap. And rapping is talking the noise. You got to be able to say it. You got to be able to say it definitively. And you got to be able to say it with power.
Dr. Leo Twiggs and Dr. Frank Martin. After this. Hey y'all, producer Drew here. It's the new year and you know what that means, don't you? It means new things to see. On January 21st, the CMA will open Our Own Work, Our Own Way, Ascendant Women Artists in the Johnson Collection. This exhibition brings together 41 female artists of the 20th century with connections to the South, including Emma Amos, Beverly Buchanan, Elaine de Kooning, Zelda Fitzgerald, Gwendolyn Knight, and Columbia's own Laura Spong. And on February 18th, explore the art of the Near East in Reverent Ornament, art from the Islamic world, featuring art that celebrates everyday life, history, and culture in Iran, Egypt, India, Syria, and Turkey from the 17th and 19th centuries. Learn more about all the new CMA experiences 2023 has to offer on our website, www.columbiamuseum.org. Happy New Year. And now, back to the show. Welcome back. Up next, you're going to hear part of a conversation that was recorded hybrid, both at the Columbia Museum of Art and at Leo Twiggs' studio in Orangeburg, South Carolina. Due to the nature of this conversation and the way it was recorded, the audio isn't as clean as it could be, but I think the value of the content makes it well worth including. We're jumping in the middle with Dr. Twiggs talking about the artists Elizabeth Catlett and Samela Lewis. I hope you'll enjoy.
Well, I met both of these women. I met Samela very early because we attended conferences together. And she was the go-to person. There's no question about that. She was writing about young, emerging African-American artists. I was one of them. The first time I got published was in her books. And the first time many young African-American artists got published was through her book, because she wanted to expose young African-Americans, emerging African-Americans. She wanted them to be exposed to the world of art. And I think it's time now to just talk about what that world was in the time when Samela and Elizabeth Catlett were working here in our state. I spoke right after I got at the University of Georgia. I spoke at the Columbia Museum when it was on Taylor Street here. And they had a meeting of the Southeastern Museum Association. And the Southeastern Museum Association goes to associations for all the Southern artists. And I was surprised that they asked me to speak. In fact, when I spoke, I was the only African-American in the room. And the subject of my speech was, and it was developed into a paper, was the art and the Black community. And we were on the Taylor Street Museum was there then. And I remember saying in that speech that one of the reasons you don't see African Americans going to the museums is because they don't have anything in the museum to see that look like themselves, that they needed to have arts exhibits that look like themselves. At the time, they had survey shows, and that was the way they exposed African American artists to other people. And a survey show, let me tell you, was 30 artists, one work each by that artist. They'd write a short bio, and that was it. And I said in my speech that when you do that, all you're doing is looking at a person's work through a keyhole. You don't really see the full power of the work. And so I went on to say, and I remember this because this was a vivid experience at that time, was that why is it that you don't have a one-man show about African-American artists? Is that if we look back at the Columbia Museum at the time, in the past 25 years, no show by an African-American artist has ever been mounted at the museum. And when I said that, a South Carolina museum director was in the back of the room, and he got up. I saw him get up and go out, because he felt I wasn't telling the truth. I know he was, because he's the kind of guy who would have challenged you. And I said that if you take a black ball and put it in a bowl, drop a hole in it, and put all of the museums in the southeast end of them, and shake that black ball up for 25 years, at least one time a black ball would fall through that hole. The probability of falling through that hole. And so Is it an omission or an exclusion? And of course, I looked back in the room and this person came back in and sat quietly where he was before. And I knew I had him. One of the things that we always advocated for is more exposure for African American artists. And that was an example of that. That speech turned into a paper that was subsequently published in the Association of Museums Journal, at the American Museum Journal, and I got a lot of comments about it. But it was like what was happening with Samela and Elizabeth. They were making sure that African Americans' art become a part of the world stage.
Well, I'm immediately thinking of two instances of African American artists who are quite distinguished who didn't have shows in South Carolina in any major venue. One is Evan Harleston, who tried to mount a show in Charleston, but it was taken down before it was shown in the Gibbs because he was related to the Harlestons, who were sponsors of the museum, and they didn't want the connection because he was an African-American artist who had actually been awarded by the Harmon Foundation. The other was William H. Johnson, who, when he did come back home, and he did some exhibitions in Florence, but he ended up being arrested for drawing on the street. So yeah, there was a different atmosphere. It's a complicated situation in terms of our past. So what I'm going to do is go forward and look at some of the shared themes you have, because all three of you are artists who have changed the perception of the role of not only American artists of African descent, but you've changed the perception of the role of art. You with the innovation in materials that you exercised, Elizabeth Catlett with the political themes that her works use around feminism and the presence of women as creatives, and of course, Samela Lewis about the intellectual contributions of Americans of African descent and African American women in particular. So you're all transformative in different ways. This is, of course, Elizabeth Catlett at in the foyer of the Steinbeck Museum. Yeah. Would you talk a little bit about her visit here?
Well, I remember picking her up from the airport, and while we were driving along, we were chatting, and she said, "Gee, that shirt you have on is so white." I said, apparently she's in Mexico and they don't get a lot of Clorox and stuff over there. So she commented on that. And then we chatted, and she wanted to meet students because she was about young artists, inspiring them. And so she met and spoke to classes. She talked about her work. And Elizabeth did prints. And anybody who's collecting art, the first place you go is prints because it's less expensive than other kinds of painting, other kinds of art. And Elizabeth did several prints, showed the prints there. And if you look at the people who were a part of this social change and making art as agents of social change, they wanted to make sure that they made art that people could understand. And for our students, when she spoke to them and told them about the fact that they ought to create art that people can understand, that was right up their line because they really wanted to do that.
Well, it's true that the dedication she had to the people, that she wanted the art to be available to a wide audience, and that was one of the reasons she chose, because sculpture is one of her main ways of working. But sculpture, a very select group of people are able to afford sculpture, and then the difficulties. So printmaking, and both she and Samela Lewis were very involved in printmaking. I just wanted to show people the facility of the Steinbeck Museum, of course, which is pretty much built around you by President Nance at South Carolina State. And of course, the idea of the planetarium was the idea of Dr. Clemmy Weber, who is your colleague there, showing, again, women in the sciences at State and how this sort of transformation of the campus. Because when the Ebony article came out about the Steinbeck, the thing that's so unique about that facility is it's a museum and planetarium combined.
Yes, it was saw it as a science museum, art and science museum combined.
And this intersection of the arts and sciences is something that you and I always try to foreground when we're doing our programming. And here's just the main gallery so that people see that it was your idea to have these modular units to adapt that space so you could have many different kinds of installations and exhibitions in that space. So it was conceived as a very, very adaptable, very modern
space. And I wanted it to be an elegant space. I haven't gone to NYU and gone to all the galleries. One of the things that I tricked them into giving me a pocket wood floor because they were going to put carpet in there. And so once they asked me, what does carpet do in the big gallery or the small gallery? I said, small gallery. And they put it in there. And so I had this pocket wood floor, and it was really with pocket wood floors and the movable kiosks that you see there. It gave the space a kind of elegance. And that's the one thing I remember about the museums in New York and the galleries, that when you walked in, it featured the art, but there was a sense of elegance. And I wanted it to have that. And when people came into the museum, I would remember them saying, wow. And they would go in the planetarium and they'd say, wow. And so we call ourselves a 2-wow facility.
And then, of course, you also had the responsibility to fill the galleries with exhibitions. And so one of the things you acquired is this historic exhibition, Harlem on My Mind, which was originally shown at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and is an exhibition that transformed the making of exhibitions in our country. It was one of the early blockbuster exhibitions. It created a terrible controversy, which actually encouraged the beginning of the incorporation of Americans of African descent in curatorial work. And Benny Andrews demonstrated against it, Romar Bearden, because the exhibition did not include works by the artists who were living in Harlem, who were visual artists, but it did have photography because Alan Schurner was more interested in new media and in documentation, and he was not trying to show traditional media. And that created a great deal of flack. And that fed into how you were able to acquire this. Could you just tell us the story about acquiring?
Yeah. I think I was in New York at the time, maybe studying at NYU, and somebody said, do you know that they took all those works down that they had at the museum, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and is stored in the library on 42nd Street? And I think they want to give it to somebody. You ought to try to ask ask them for it. And so I wrote, and they said, well, if you want it, you got to come and pick it up. Well, that was a problem there. So I talked to the president, and Nancy at the time, he says, I don't know. He said, let's see, can we get alumni, South Carolina State alumni in New York, the region, to see if they could sponsor it. Never happened. And so here I was waiting and seeing what we could do. And so I got the planetarium. He was planetarium. He helped with the planetarium. But Don Walters was teaching in the science department. And Don took a U-Haul. It turned out that it was a U-Haul that was too small, and went to New York and picked those things up and brought them back. And we shall ever be grateful to Don for doing that, because he said he was so loaded till when he came off the ramp, he almost turned over. But he came and we brought those things here, and just in the nick of time, because I understand the museum in San Francisco, the African American Museum there, had said that if we didn't come to get them by a certain time, they would come and get them and pick them up. And they had their trucks ready to go.
And these were photographs by Gordon Parks, by James Vanderzee, by Lloyd Yearwood, by all of these very important African-American artists, and also documenting images from the Harlem Renaissance, with images of Zora Neale Hurston and Claude McKay and Paul Laurence Dunbar. So it was an incredible collection to have acquired for the school, for that academic environment. And that was, I was saying, pioneers. This was the foresight of Dr. Twiggs in planning that program for South Carolina State. And of course, then you acquired African collections. This was from Nancy and Roderick McDonald's collection. And it's, I think, one of the major African collections at an HBCU in our state, and probably one of the largest collections of African art. But the interesting thing about this collection at State is that it is the ethnic groups that were the seminal gene pool of those who were enslaved in South Carolina. So it's the Phi, the Timne, the Mende, the Dan, the peoples who made up the population here are represented, or their cultures are represented in this collection that you acquired.
Yeah, that was the important thing. We started collecting African and African American art. That was our focus, and that's what we did.
And of course, there are the works by people like William H. Johnson and Romar Bearden and Ellis Wilson, also in the collection, Lois Milo Jones. So you began this program of collecting to create a core for the students to be able to look at works by American artists of African descent. But the facility could also show works from any culture, from any group of people, which we always did that. And then you had the opportunity to have this fine arts building built at South Carolina State, designed by Harvey Gantt. Could you talk a little bit about that?
That, to me, that was the icing on the cake. When I came to South Carolina State in '64, it took me almost 10 years for the first art graduate. We had an art program. And then we worked in a building, Turner Hall, and we worked in two rooms, and we were part of the music department. And I always wanted a standalone structure. And then we had a president who had been at A&T and who knew Harvey Gantt, because Harvey was mayor of Charlotte. And I said, we want a building on our campus by Harvey, because Harvey, of course, is from Charleston. I knew Harvey very well. And this fellow had to fight the state bureaucracy to get that done. But he did. And I worked with Harvey. We sat down and talked about it. I told Harvey that when they come on the campus, I want them to not have somebody tell them where the fine arts building was, but to say, that must be the place. And I showed him the museum, and I said, you notice the museum is uniquely different, and I want your building to be uniquely different. And if you put that image up, it is elegantly different.
And so now we come to you and your work, and I think almost everyone in the audience probably knows you're from St. Stephen, that you are someone raised in South Carolina, educated here, who is kind of in many ways an ambassador of the unique culture of South Carolina because of what your artwork is. You have devised this technique and now beginning to use more assemblage as well as your batik technique, your batik method. But I'm going to talk a little bit as we go through about some shared themes that you and Sonella Lewis and Elizabeth Catlett have in your work, but also about innovation in terms of your work, because the works are usually on cotton. They're not using paint in the traditional way. They are using dye. You have a double allusion to the ancestry, or to the reasons why Africans were enslaved and brought here for the early cash crops of indigo and then cotton. And that is just inherent in your work. It's not a bombastic, declamatory kind of announcement, but it is just a very subtle incorporation into what you're doing. And do you want to say anything about this work, Messages from Home, which shows you?
Well, let me say first, people ask me all the time, why did you choose to do dyes and wax on fabric instead of traditional paint on canvas? I mean, I think your artwork is your voice. And to me, when I was introduced to batik at the Art Institute of Chicago, and I saw the color qualities there, it just felt like home to me. And I don't know why. People say that's because of your heritage and because of, I know that where I grew up, right down the road from there are old rice deltas where they did it. And I know that they did dyeing, and I know that cotton was king and all of that in the region. But, sometimes I guess it just interred in your bones. And I just felt when I started dyeing, when I started using fabric, cotton fabric, that I felt at home, and that the subtleties of the colors were so much like what I grew up with.
You've just heard excerpts from a conversation with artist Dr. Leo Twiggs and the art historian Dr. Frank Martin, recorded on February 12th of this year. If you'd like to see more of this conversation, we'll have the whole program available on YouTube and our website, www.columbiamuseum.org. Full disclosure, I originally planned this episode to come out in January. We decided to hold off so we could have part of that conversation you heard with Frank and Leo just now, but with that delay, it really gave me some time to think. Not just about how to edit the episode or write the scripted parts, but more about why it's so important in the first place. The truth is, while I may never know what it's like to be Black in America, this history is just as relevant to me and you, everyone else in the United States. Without the contributions of African Americans, the nation we live in today would not exist. Full stop, would not. Whether it's February, March, April, June, July, December, this history matters. It's something we're celebrating. Ray will be back next month. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Binder, a production of the Columbia Museum of Art. Today's episode was hosted, edited, and produced by me, Drew Barron. Special assistance from Joelle Ryan Cook. Today's guest host was Dr. Nancy Tolson. And today's episode also featured portions of a talk with Dr. Leo Twiggs and Dr. Frank Martin. That's a whole lot of doctors. To learn more about CMA exhibitions and programs, visit our website, www.columbiamuseum.org.
Drew told me that we might be talking about this, but this is a gift for you.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm a bookaholic, especially when it comes to art. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
The incredible joy. Yes, Black art gives me joy.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you. And evidently it gives you joy too.
It does.
Okay, we're not ready though yet, are we?
So I definitely recorded all of that just now.
Oh, okay.
Which I'm going to use at the end of the episode and have you have that really, because that's really endearing.
Lovely.